I've stumbled across a permaculture designed smallholding in the east of Zimbabwe in 1991 and ended up working on that farm for a couple of years. And really struck me was at the time was this is the first thing I've come across in my life that absolutely makes sense um, in terms of understanding the bigger picture and then applying that understanding to somewhere specific. And so I kind of that set me on a path. So it's been a long and interesting journey since then, and I'll try and give you a little bit of a flavour of it. And I'm also going to kind of a little bit assume that we know a little bit about what permaculture is already, or do I need to fill out a bit more background?
Well, I can fill in a little bit more later on about the principles.
Okay, sure. So okay, so sometimes don't have the slide here, but sometimes I offer a definition and I say it's three things. And actually my logo, the Sector39 logo, reflects that. It's 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 um it's a set of ethics, three ethics, guiding values, if you like, that inform the process. And it's also a set of 12 principles, or one way of looking at it anyway, derived from observing nature. And the core idea really is let nature be our teacher. And if we observe nature in a sort of ongoing way, what is it that it teaches us? So there's interesting thoughts around that. And the third element of what permaculture is about is taking these ideas and applying them. It's the design part. It's how do we actually create change in the world? How do we make manifest? It's all very well having these long-term ethics and values. But how do we actually make them manifest in the world? So we're really interested in the process of translating ideas through our understanding of the natural world to create real change in the world that firstly helps meet our own personal needs. So it's also highly sort of functional and personal. Um, Jack mentioned the One School, One Planet project, and we started that in 2016, which was just straight after the Paris Climate Agreement. You remember that? December 2015. That is now 7 years ago. And I thought at the time, I thought it's a very interesting way perhaps to frame the work that we need to do is we're all bored about talking about climate change. Let's understand the targets that we need to achieve, the sort of the road ahead. And it's summarized in this graph, and of which there are three values, which I think are very important. And I'll just mention it as in touching is, and just to say is that when we have these IPCC summits, Interglobal Panel on Climate Change, that's a coming together of governments and corporations with the sort of science and the NGOs, and whatever they come up with is a compromise, because climate scientists would like to see much more urgent action, and governments are always dragging their feet going, what about the economy and so forth. So what we're seeing here is a compromise, and it starts in 2020 and it maps out a 30-year process of change. So that's what we're on. We're in that 30-year process of change, and we're right at the beginning of it, really. The sort of order is, where are we at in 2020? Well, our total global emissions, climate change emissions, measured in tons of carbon dioxide, is 40 gigatons a year. 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. And the treaty very clearly says we've got to get to as close to zero as we can in as quickly as possible. The treaty allows us 3 decades, but advises us to try and beat these targets. So in that first decade, from 2020 to 2030, we're supposed to halve emissions from 40 to 20. So, and this is going to set the trajectory into the future. Now, we haven't started off very well, so we're going to have to do a bit of catching up. But this is what we're supposed to be thinking about. In that second decade, for 2030 to 2040, we're supposed to halve emissions again. And it's a smaller amount. It's from 20 to 10. But realistically, it's going to be twice as difficult because you will have done the easy stuff already. In the third decade, we've got to get from 10 to 5, another halving. And there's an admission there is that we're never going to get to 0, that it's going to be too difficult. There's too many things hardwired into the system to get to actual 0. At every climate change conference, there's been a group of people saying, yes, but what about technology? We can solve the problem with technology. Okay, that's the blue line. That's carbon capture and storage using mechanistic processes. Well, these processes don't exist yet. We don't have any data. We don't know how they scale up. Some of the ideas exist, but we haven't scaled them up. It's a shot in the dark. So for fun, let's allow ourselves 5 gigatons of mechanical removal of carbon from the atmosphere. That's what the treaty allows for. That brings us to net zero by 2050. We're advised that really we should be trying to get there by about 2040. So that's what we have to do. That's the track that we're on. The third line on the graph, and that's the thing that I'm most interested in, and I think that the permaculture speaks very much to this transition, is currently farming, land use, land management, habitat management is responsible for 5 billion tons of emissions a year. And that needs to not just go to 0, it needs to go negative, because the ultimate long-term storage for carbon is in the soil. And if we can have farming and land management, habitat management techniques, which actually stack away large, significant amounts of carbon into the soil, we can then make it run backwards. We can actually go into negative emissions. And that's what we need to get to. Anyway, that's the Paris Agreement. That's what's in the background. That's what our politicians and scientists and everything have been discussing all of this time. And I think that provides an overarching context for all of the work that we're trying to do moving forward. We've got to beat this. We've got to do better than this. This is the challenge we've been given. Okay, so what's Sector 39 all about? Well, our mission statement is to accelerate permaculture learning through education, to develop working examples that we can learn from, and to bring permaculture into new areas. I've realized that we're not going to get anywhere just by sitting in our comfort zone talking to the people who we already agree with. We've got to keep pushing it out there and keep learning. And the best way to learn is to create models that we can evaluate and improve and work from. Here's maybe a little example of an application of permaculture design principles, and this is actually the reason why we're called Sector 39. Is you're looking at the roof of 39 London Street, Reading. This is a development education centre called Reading International Solidarity, and that was what their roof looked like in 2000. And it was leaking and needed fixing, and they didn't have the money to do it. So we went away and we wrote a lottery funding bid to turn the roof into a global garden, something that talked about the heritage of plants that we've received from our ancestors, food and medicine. And we designed a permaculture forest garden and put it on the roof of this building. Now there's something like 170 species of plants here. We really tried to reflect the diversity and all of these plants have at least 2 or 3 uses for the environment and for people as well. It's fed by rainwater, which is captured from the roof and stored in tanks and then pumped around at night time. And compost and materials and other organic waste from the building. And you can see how what was a derelict sort of uninviting space is now something that can be a community asset. People can come together, learn and help build community within this environment. So we've turned something that was negative into something that's positive, and we've only really used local and natural materials to do it, and also natural processes. Hey, that's permaculture. That's what we're proposing. We're not trying to import loads of resources from far away. We're not trying to use energy hungry methods to solve problems, and we're also trying to set up systems that can be largely self-managing. So now this garden is fully established, all we really have to do is pick the fruits and prune the trees. There's not much else to do. And it's actually one of the best examples of a food forest I now know in the UK. It's very interesting working on rooftops and stuff like that. So trying to push, I guess, and trying to show what might be possible. That was the purpose of this project. It's now, well, it's over 20 years old, so it's fully established, and it's only sort of carrying on to be ever more interesting. Anyway, that was part of my story. I also Permaculture made me think about mutually beneficial relationships. It made me think about how can I achieve my own personal goals by forming alliances, beneficial alliances with other people and places. That led me into housing cooperatives. And in 1995, we bought what was a derelict rundown farm in Snowdonia, moved 8 people into it. We set up a housing cooperative called Chicken Shack, and we set about turning. Now, so if we just look at this little landscape here, is what we're seeing on the left. This is Snowdonia. This is supposed to be a national park, rich in wildlife habitat. There's nothing. What you're seeing is a sheep monoculture. There's very little habitat for nature. There's very little places for nesting sites for birds. There's no passageways for wildlife to travel through the landscape. It's an ecological disaster. And you can see in this picture here how we've, over the years that we've occupied this site, we've done everything we can to transform it away from being a monoculture to be a complex, diverse landscape that holds water and creates obviously many opportunities for wildlife, but also that provides, this is all vegetable gardens and orchards here, that provides at least some of the resources needed by the people who live there. So this is an ongoing permaculture project. I lived there for 13 years. I spent 2 years setting it up, and then I've moved on to other pastures, but it's still there and it's still going on. So I guess I'm just showing you a few applications within, of how I've used, and with colleagues and people around me, we've used permaculture ideas to set up ongoing things which are complex and interesting, but that really embody the values within permaculture. I've dipped in and out of many different projects over the years, and I think in 2005, which was towards the end of that roof garden project, people started asking me, "Well, do I teach? How do we find out more about permaculture?" And that was when we created this name and this partnership, and we began teaching, and more recently formally registered as a company, and started sort of reaching out in different directions. And it's been a very interesting journey, and one which maybe is still gaining in momentum. But in 2014, through the Wales for Africa program, we had a chance to go out to Uganda, where I met organic farming networks. And in 2016, we went out and taught a PDC, is a 72-hour intense permaculture learning experience, a course training that mixes together theory, applications and strategies, and then design methodology. It brings those 3 things together. And 2016, I thought it'd be interesting to try teaching a course out in Uganda and to see where that might lead. A country where still 70% of people are farmers, and where the average age is less than 15. So it's a young country where people are very receptive to new ideas and have limited economic opportunity. So interesting. There we are. There's also some of our trainees and team members, and it's just sort of something that's gone on to have a life of its own. And I'll touch on this a bit more later on in the presentation. But again, it's been really interesting. But we've sort of thrown ourselves right in the deep end, and so it's been a very, very steep learning curve as well. And the picture on the top left is actually a training team in a place called Bidi Bidi in West Nile, which is northern Uganda, where there is the world's biggest refugee settlement. It's 1.2 million people who've been displaced from southern Sudan and who've settled in northern Uganda, and they've been told that they can stay and build homesteads and settlements. And in 2018, we ran a 6-month training course there with refugees to see how a trainer of trainers program, to see, again, very interesting to see how these ideas translate in different contexts, in different cultures, to see, what comes out of it. It's been super, super interesting. Yeah, so I guess off the back of having mentioned that, is permaculture is a global phenomenon. The ideas originated, well, first sort of written down and described in Australia, but by two Australians. But really, they'd got their inspiration from around the world, from traditional cultures, first nation cultures, and from science, from everywhere, really. So we were reminded this is a global phenomenon. In 2015, the International Permaculture Convergence, the big conference, was in London, held in London. It's the first time it's been in the UK. I think there were people from 88 countries there. So, and I know that permaculture is in many more than that. So it's everywhere. I found this quote which I liked, a reminder that it's not just about regenerative agriculture and regenerative soils. It's about healing interpersonal relationships, reconciling, history, healing of people, and something that has to be inclusive of all. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. It's something that is open and inclusive and really understands the journey that we've been on to get to this place where we're facing a climate emergency, where there are refugees and displaced people everywhere. There's reasons how we got here, and we mustn't forget that. So a few thoughts about current work. Through this Sector 39 partnership, and I say over the years, I've collaborated with all sorts of different organizations and projects and people. And it's made me think, someone said to me a few years ago, Steve, it's all very good with your courses and training, but how do we replicate you? How do we create, more teachers and make this a continuous process? And that's what led us to think about having the aspiration to create an academy of permaculture, and that's sort of the next stage of the journey that I'm on. And yeah, very, very keen to collaborate with other people who have a similar kind of vision. Okay. I want to I'll just jump over this, but it's very well having these big ideas and around the world and different countries and different cultures and everything. Is that let's ground ourselves. And this is a place called Trevlack Farm. It's just a few miles up the road from where I live. I've been teaching permaculture at the farm for, well, since 2010, I think, and built a very good relationship with the farm. In that time, because of our presence there and the conversations we've had with the farm, the farmers, and the stakeholders of the farm, they've gone very much down the regenerative agriculture route, and again sought to find ways to bring diversity onto the farm, diversity of yields, to become fully organic, to sort to emulate natural processes much more, moving to doing mob grazing and so many different techniques. And what I spoke to them about a couple of years ago was I wanted to set up some long-term soil building experiments, and I wanted to also understand better how we can build carbon rich soils. And obviously, this part of this a strategy that we have to have is to learn how to sequestrate carbon. Can we use biological processes to translocate carbon from the atmosphere into the soils? If we put carbon into the soils, what impact does that have on our ability to grow food and other plants? So April last year, I ran a PDC, it's a 12-day course at Trevlack Farm. And we started to talk about this ambition and start to build a little partnership around that. And we came up with the idea of the Trevlack Mandala Garden. And there's a little sketch that one of the students made at the time. And then we've gone on with volunteers and all sorts of other helpers to slowly begin to develop this garden. The idea of it is, it's quite simple really, but it's there's 20 raised beds, each is 4 square meters, but half of them have been dug over and half of them we've done no dig methods. Half of them we've treated with compost from the farm, and half of them we've treated with a mix of compost and biochar. Now, I'll talk a little bit about what biochar is in a moment. And the other thing that we've been doing though is, so there you can see the dig side and the no dig side. We've treated them slightly differently, but what we've been doing is, I'll talk about the biochar a little bit. So what is biochar? All things that are plants, anything that's grown and has lived, it's largely made out of carbon. The structure of the plant is made out of carbon, and we can do clever ways of pyrolizing. Here we got, these are hedge trimmings. So one of the changes they've made at the farm is, instead of flailing their hedges with one of those rather aggressive hedge trimmers, they've let the hedges grow out, and then every few years, in section by section, they've been laid, and which means about 3/4 of the mass that's grown within the hedge is removed. We leave it for a year to dry out, and then we pyrolyze it. Now, there are very clever ways of making biochar in kilns and doing controlled burns. Because we're out on a farm and we're doing it on a big scale in the winter when the fields are wet, we've worked out a method of doing it on a bonfire. Basically, you put the big sticks at the bottom and the thin twigs at the top. You light the fire and you use the thin twigs to create the heat to pyrolyze the sticks, and then you extinguish the fire with water just when it's getting going, and what you're left with is biochar. So what's the difference between charcoal and biochar? Well, they're pretty much the same thing. Charcoal, when we talk about charcoal, we're usually thinking about lump wood charcoal to put on the barbecue, big lumps of nice, made from wood. Biochar is the same, chemically the same thing, but it can be made from anything, and it can be a powder. It doesn't have to be lumps at all. In fact, the smaller the particles, the better, the more useful it is to us in our soil building experiments. So what you're looking at there is a box of pure carbon. That's what it is, and it's been made from the hedge trimmings. And what we've done with that is mix it with compost and animal bedding, and it just creates the best, lovely compost that you can imagine. And we've been applying that to our beds in our test site in the Mandala Garden. So half of the beds, the lower half, have been treated with this compost and biochar mixture, and we've been observing to see if we can see a difference. Is it really helping? And in what way? How's it affecting the soil texture, the soil quality, the ability to accept water and to hold on water? And also, how's it affecting the fertility? There's a question that we confronted with then is, how do we measure the fertility of the soil without incurring lots of costs of sending off soil samples to the laboratory? And we came across through the Griffin network, which is Growing Real Food for Nutrition, and they're working with this thing called a refractometer. which tells you the bricks value of the plants that you're growing. So I'll just deconstruct that. Sounds a bit complicated, but it's really simple. You take some sap pliers, which we can see in the picture here. You squish part of the plant and you get the sap, the liquid, not the matter, not the just the liquid, the sap from the plant, and you put that on the lens of the brixometer, and you point it at the light, and you see a scale. It goes normally from 0 to 30, and it tells you that's so. If it was only water that we'd put on this lens, the light would shine straight through it. If you put plant sap on it, the more syrupy, the more dense that sap is, the more it bends the light. And so that gives us a very quick approximation of the nutrient density of the plant that we're growing. And through doing repeated testing, we start to see how the plants are responding to the different soil treatments. I've got to tell you, it's fascinating. It really, really is. And it's such a simple way to make these measurements, to make these observations. And what it's telling us is the less we disturb the soil and the more we develop the microbial life within the soil, then the higher quality the food is, the nutrient density of the food, and it can be many times higher. And also what we're learning is the higher the bricks value of the plant, the less it is prone to pest attack, and the better it tastes. So this is a win-win-win situation. And of course, well, not of course, but we're finding that the biochar treated beds are producing better quality, healthier, and more nutritious plants. And that is because the biochar has an enormous surface area. Even a teaspoon of it would have hundreds of square meters of surface area. And that creates habitat for soil microbes. And that's why this composting process with the manures and stuff, and it turns out to be so important. And we have regular sessions at the farm every Thursday. Volunteers come and we are interacting with some young people and doing a bit of citizen science, and we share our results back with the Griffin Network, who are speaking to farmers all over the world to see, well, not all now, but sample groups in many different places, to see how everyone else is experiencing this. So we've got lovely space at the farm to work on, and off we go doing our thing. Now, so I guess I'm talking here about applications, how our understanding of the ideas within permaculture, how we're applying them to different areas of life, whether it's housing, food growing, education, and actually showing how all of these things combine together, and they actually help us sequestrate carbon into the soils, and also help us reduce our own carbon footprints by localizing food production and so forth. So this when we went out to Africa, this photo here is from 2016. It's the first permaculture course that we ran out in Uganda, and we met these sort of pioneer type people who were really keen to learn, who had already had their own networks around them, and they really absorbed this information. But they didn't just sit on it. They took it away and they applied it to their own communities. So in this picture, we see on the left, a gentleman called Paul Agola. He's from northwest Kenya, and he's working there with my friend Richie, who's from Wales. And Paul's come to learn because he said he comes from a part of the world where there is food poverty. He sees his neighbors struggling around him. They have a very as climate change means that their weather systems are becoming less consistent, and there's some periods of drought and all sorts of different new challenges seem to be coming. So Paul took the ideas of what he learnt on the permaculture course, and so throughout the course we move from the theory to the sort of the techniques to the design methodology. And here we see one of the participants of the course working on the sort of design presentation and showing the steps that we might take between moving from our aspiration to harmonize our work with nature and all of the other things, how we might move from that aspiration to a step-by-step design plan, which we can then implement and then begin to measure and quantify the outcomes. Here's me working with Paul. This is actually in the when we were working with the refugees in 2018, and Paul's taken a lot of that experience and gone and helped share it, obviously, with our trainees. Here we are working on a food growing system. This is designed to catch and hold rainwater so that when we get heavy tropical rainfall, it doesn't flow over the surface and cause erosion, but it's trapped in the system and percolates into the ground. So Paul took these ideas back home. He spoke to the people in the community. They released a piece of land for him, and he began planning step by step, using what he'd learned to think about how he can trap more water, build more soil, and build a system around his growing system to support all of the functions that are going on within it. So within a couple of years of Paul doing his initial training, he had a functioning, running permaculture training center. He's called it Permo Africa. He's created a shift in his whole community. He has trained probably 600 farmers in 15 villages, all around the surrounding district, and it's only multiplying. And again, we're trying to build mutually beneficial relationships, whether it's our relationship with the natural world, our relationship with all of the different components within the natural world, but also our relationship within other members of our communities, and here between Permo Africa there in Kenya with Sector39, our training network, and people who've been funding us over the last 3 years. The thistle logo is a UK charity called Arkelton Trust. I've had a chance to go back and visit Paul and see how he's doing, and to see him teaching these ideas in his own classroom that he's gone away and fundraised for and built his own sort of community around him. It's tremendously exciting and tremendously reinforcing to see the potentials of what can be done with these quite simple ideas. So Paul's creating his own certification, building his own network with trainers around him. Well, actually, this is another trainer, Ugandan, Ali Tebendeki. Paul's not the only one. This has gone off in many different directions. Here's that same view of Paul's training center from. So here we go, 2018 to just 2 or 3 years later. He's transformed. And in creating this demonstration plot is he can invite people in from the surrounding community. They can see the potentials of how working in harmony with nature. They can see the potentials, the many different yields and outputs that come from it, and then take these ideas back to their communities. And then Paul and his team will follow that up with outreach visits and help them start off their own demonstration plots. Here is one of those demonstration plots. This was built during the pandemic. Community in the Homa Bay region in Kenya, and different family groups were visiting this plot on alternate days, so they didn't all have big groups there because it was the pandemic, and they're picking cut and come again greens every day, and the stakeholders of this project, and you can see it's been built out of local and natural materials. They've concentrated resources to create these highly productive raised bed systems. fed by compost, and yeah, it's a starting point. From then, once communities can see that this works, they then want to go, what are we going to do next? And then that's where you get sort of a progression of ideas and a succession of different initiatives start coming. But you have to demonstrate it. It's what we've learned. There's no point standing on your soapbox preaching to people. They've got to see it and experiencing it for themselves. And once they do, they start to innovate and take these ideas on board and explore them, for themselves. And what's wonderful about this picture, makes me so happy, is to see the woman on the left, Stella. She's from Uganda. She's traveled down to Kenya to help reinforce the work that they're doing there and to do evaluation and take photos so that we can then use them in teaching. So again, mutually beneficial relationships. Communities coming together in Kenya, relating to communities in Uganda, sharing ideas of us here in Wales. So, mentioning Wales, I've recently just been working with a habitat diversification project up in just further up the valley where I live here in Paris. A group of 2 or 3 families have come together with the aspiration of creating a community woodland on very tired, degraded pasture land. And they've created a vision of it can still be a pasture, it can still function, have the same kind of work in the same kind of way, but we can enlarge all of the hedgerows. We can create large areas of habitat. We can create pathways for wildlife to move through the landscape. We can trap much more water, and we can obviously build more soil carbon just by diversifying, just by encouraging some of the wilderness to come back. And again, using these processes as a way to build relationships with the local community, invite people into it so that they can see what's going on, be inspired by it, and take those ideas home and and work with them in different ways. So yeah, other farms locally who are beginning to pick up on these ideas. And I think so. It's a bit random, this assortment, but it's sort of the nature of the process is these sort of scattergun approaches of seeds landing, people translating these ideas and making them relevant into their own communities. So I think these last few pictures are from a really wonderful and inspirational project in Rwanda. I was lucky enough to be there in March this year. And this is Rwandan women's permaculture. The particular woman behind this, Rose Nabigwere, we see in the middle here in the black shirt. She's understood the marginalization of women in her community, that they're responsible to provide food for their families, and the needing for solidarity and working together, and has created this initiative. They've partnered with a local school. They've started to incorporate elements of food forest, of diversification and yields within the school system, and starting to think about many different other products that they could build into their food forest system and transform the school. There's not to say that kids growing up in Rwanda don't get enough protein. Their growth is stunted from not enough calories and from too much starches and not enough of everything else. So think about the value of incorporating these polyculture systems of plants and herbs and veg and fruits and so forth into learning environments, and then encouraging the students and the pupils to interact with them and learn, and to begin to supplement their diets from within the curriculum of the school. And I think it's what Jack touched on at the beginning with our One School, One Planet project. Our aspiration was we need to bring these ideas into the core of the curriculum and not talk about it in a cold academic way, but do it, and do it in a way in which we can benefit from. So here's our little garden. This is in Teso in Uganda, and the woman in blue there, Deborah is her name. She trained with us a couple of years ago. She's gone away and she's transformed her whole village. We're talking about 600 households, and they have all changed to using permaculture methodology. It's quite extraordinary, really, to see how quickly, how readily people have taken up these ideas. This is a low energy stove design. It's made from the clay of a termite mound. It's formed around the stem of a banana, and you cut holes around your cooking pots. And it reduces the amount of fuel you need for cooking by 85%, and it eliminates all the smoke. So she commented how in a village of 600 households, all 600 had changed to this stove. And she said, it's funny, there's no smoke in the village anymore. Inhalation of wood smoke is the #1 cause of avoidable disease in the majority world. It's just a matter of empowering people to use the materials around them and to challenge them to get into a sort of problem-solving mindset. They can begin to sort out the priorities and to meet their needs by using local resources and good design. Okay, there we go. I'll stop there. I've just sort of given you a quick sort of whistle-stop tour, really, of how these permaculture ideas have been manifesting and popping up, whether it's here in Wales or through my own life, through my work, or through the people who've studied with us and then taken those ideas for themselves. I'll finish with this model, and I like this a lot as a way of thinking about how we might come together to create long-term goals, because that's the only way that we can create change. We have to be consistent over time. We're not going to solve any. So I gave you the IPC transition model. It's 3 decades. It's a lot. That's a long-term goal, and we're going to have to be focused and together to be and consistent over time to achieve these things. So in this model, what we're kind of saying to our students is the thing that brings us together is shared values. And if we can begin to actually define and name what those values are, in permaculture, we say it's care for the earth, care for people, but meeting your own needs first, but setting limits, so that we have surplus to invest into community and invest into the environment. If we can come together around a set of mutual values, then from that point, we can begin to identify and discuss long-term goals. So it's all very well, it's all a bit cold, talking about soil carbon or atmospheric carbon and so forth. What about me? What about my life? What about my ambitions? It's got to speak to all of those things. And to achieve those long-term goals, we have to build them into strategies. And to achieve each strategy, we've got to build that down into a series of activities. And to understand how to start our activities, we need to identify the resources that we need to fulfill that. But we're not going to be able to agree about resources and budgets or activities if we can't agree about the core long-term goal. And it has to be creating a society in which we can all meet our needs. I need to eat. I have ambitions. I have things I want to achieve in my life. But at the same time, I recognize, well, so do you. How may we collaborate so we can both achieve those things that we want? And to have any quality of life, we need a functional, flourishing natural environment. The same natural environment that provides us with air, clean water, and with fertile soils with which we can grow our foods. And those are the things which unify us. And I think that's the power of permaculture, is it gives us that, potentially that framework to understand that. So there you go. There's my whistle stop tour